talk about the process of science. The nation's poor performance in STEM fields was among many reasons that education experts from across the nation set about to develop the so-called Next Generation Science Standards, and that took place over the last several years. Their concern was that student performance in the sciences was slipping on the world stage. And there's a good deal of blame that they laid on, among other things, excessive rigidity associated with the scientific method, at least as it has been taught forever. Indeed, you won't even find a description of the scientific method in the Next Generation Science Standards. Instead, there's now a framework that includes what scientists do, and the free flow and diverse nature associated with much of what scientists do is emphasized. Unfortunately, there is a method to the process, but the new standards have left the linear nature of the process completely hidden. Now, science is a thing of beauty. It's an artistic endeavor, but most don't see the art that's inherent in what is basically a stepwise method. And I think the main problem in science education lies not with the stepwise nature of the scientific method, but with a lack of understanding of how the method actually works. And that lack of understanding is translated into a poor job of teaching the method by instructors in grade school, middle school, high school, and colleges and universities. It's not at all hard to find random activities being passed off as science these days, and inappropriate and misplaced use of hypotheses and predictions by students at all levels, and even by practicing scientists themselves. You might be saying to yourself, well, so what if people don't quite understand the scientific method? There's lots of things that aren't well understood, but in the end it doesn't really matter all that much. Yeah, but this is different. An understanding of how science works is important because it's only through a thorough understanding of the process that we can judge the merit of what are claimed to be scientific findings, to know who and what to believe. Now, I'll get to how I believe the method's being misunderstood and distorted in practice, but first let's review the method. It's actually quite simple. Science is a process. It's a way of doing business, a way of knowing. Now let me boil the process down to its simplest form and explain how individuality and creativity play roles, important roles, and then get into why I believe this beautiful process is commonly distorted. So here's the process as I see it. Science is basically a 4-part game. Step 1, you find something interestingly non-random to talk about. And this is a pattern that couldn't have arisen due to chance alone. Something caused it, something other than chance. Step 2, you suggest possible explanations or reasons why the non-random pattern exists. Then step 3, you generate predictions that necessarily follow from each hypothesis. And the last thing is you tease apart the alternative explanations or hypotheses by seeing which particular predictions hold up and which ones don't. Now let's look at this process one step at a time. And the first step, let's think about this. Concerning this part of the game, it's usually a frequentist statistics that you use to establish that there is indeed a non-random pattern of interest. What we're trying to do is decide if something could have arisen due to chance alone. If not, well then something had to cause it, and then we're going to try to figure out what that something is. So this is why you use statistics. You don't need statistics. It just helps you make a decision that you really have something interestingly non-random to talk about. Now, what's cool about this step is you use your 5 senses to perceive something, right? Any of your 5 senses. I smell something, I hear something, I see something. And then you use your statistics to convince yourself that the pattern you perceive is indeed non-random. Now, in this particular case, in this statistical hypothesis testing, you test a null hypothesis of no pattern, or what you'd expect due to chance, against the alternative hypothesis that something non-random is happening, right? Then you get into trying to explain why. So it's cool to think about this step for a minute longer. The search for patterns involves human perception, right? So this is a place in science where individual experience and creativity come into play before you ever get around to testing whether you really perceive something non-random or not. So depending on who you are, you're a male, you're a female, you're from the Northeast, you're from the Southwest, you're going to see different things and feel different things, and different things will be of interest to you. And this is a very important reason you want to have as much diversity in the scientific field as possible. What you perceive is partly a product of who you are and what you've experienced in the past and what you find interesting. Now, that's important to think about. Now let's take an example here. Let's make something up, all right? Examples always help us understand concepts. So let me use this hypothetical example to illustrate steps or concepts throughout the process. So imagine you captured, very few young western tanagers in forests that had undergone restoration forestry treatments, compared with untreated forests that are otherwise similar. And this looked interesting to you, so you conduct a statistical analysis to determine if the average numbers caught really do differ significantly between the two forest types. And let's say, yeah, they do. Significantly fewer young are caught in the treated forests. Bingo! We have a pattern. We have something interesting. We have something non-random. It's not something that could have occurred due to chance. You've already eliminated chance by doing your little statistics, right? That brings you to step 2. The real guessing game in science comes with making suggestions about what might be causing the pattern. And these are called hypotheses, which is very unfortunate because hypothesis is precisely the same word you use when you conduct your statistical tests. Confusion of the two kinds of hypotheses has led to widespread misunderstanding of what constitutes the scientific process. Scientific hypotheses should probably be called explanations to keep them distinct from statistical hypotheses. But that's never going to happen, so we're going to have to stick with the fact that we have two things using the same word. But we want to emphasize statistical hypothesis testing is not the same thing as scientific hypothesis testing. Note that there is a null statistical hypothesis, and that's what you expect due to chance. There is no such thing as a null scientific hypothesis. Now, Connor and Simberloff suggested in 1986 that there is such thing as a null scientific hypothesis. And they said, it's simply any explanation other than the one you're trying to test. It's like, what? Proposing a null scientific hypothesis in this step is ridiculous, as Jared Diamond tried repeatedly to argue back at them, because a null generates no predictions. What exactly would one predict from an explanation of anything other than your focal hypothesis? It doesn't make sense here. So null models don't belong here. They belong in step 1, and they are statistical in nature. They help us decide if we have anything interestingly non-random to talk about. And we already did our null hypothesis testing in step 1 using statistical null models. Now is the time to propose real mechanistic explanations, and a null is not one of those. So let's call these hypotheses, at least change it to research hypothesis to distinguish them from statistical hypotheses, okay? Because I guess the world's not going to start calling them explanations, even though I'd like that. Unlike statistical hypotheses, there is no limit to the number of research hypotheses that one might generate to explain a pattern. So this is another place where individual creativity comes into play in science. We're going to talk in ornithology about people who've come up with ideas after 150 years that no one ever thought of. It's amazing the kind of creativity that can come at this particular step. Okay, let's go back to our example. There were fewer western tanagers, WETAs, in cut forests, right? And we're trying to figure out why. Let's propose some alternatives. Well, hypothesis 1, H1, might be that the food resources are depleted by cutting, right? And then more of the young starved, and that's why there are fewer. Another explanation might be there's more predators that invaded the treated areas and nest success took a dive. Maybe another hypothesis is young birds are simply more wary in treated forests and they avoid your nets, and that's why you get fewer. You get the idea. There's no limit to the number of possible explanations. Limit is only set by your imagination. So let's just deal with these 3, right? This step step 3, that moves us on to step 3. See, it's amazing. This is so simple, really, the game. This is the crux of science. It's rarely conducted, even by people who call themselves scientists. In this step, you use logic to generate predictions that necessarily follow from each hypothesis, right? These are logical sequiturs. That is, you're using logic to generate these predictions. This is how science is basically an if-then game. If my hypothesis is true, then I expect to see blah, 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 blah. How many predictions follow from a given hypothesis? Well, once again, there's no limit. This is, to me, one of the most artistic parts of the game of science, because the numbers and kinds of predictions are, again, set only by one's own creativity. Predictions can be additional observations, they can be patterns that have to exist in the real world if the hypothesis is true, or they can be results from manipulations or experiments that have to occur if the hypothesis is true. But notice that experiments are not necessary to play the game of science. All you need are logic-based predictions of some sort that necessarily follow from the hypotheses. Okay? Note also that a prediction is not a guess about what you think you're going to find, as so many teachers insist. They are merely logical sequiturs that follow necessarily from a stated hypothesis. So look up there at H1. If that's true, then the following predictions absolutely necessarily follow. I will see A, I will see prediction B, I will see prediction C, etc., etc. Okay, I should also add that this step incorporates unwritten assumptions that have to be met for the predictions to absolutely necessarily follow. This is where the word assumption belongs in the game of science. And this is an inherent weakness in many scientific papers because those unstated assumptions are often not met. If an assumption isn't met, then you can't really expect the stated prediction to be observed, right? So scientists often hide these assumptions when results or subsequent observations make sense, right? But then they expose the assumptions when they observe something that doesn't come outright, right? They don't observe a prediction that was expected. They claim their assumption must not have been met, so the research hypothesis is still alive. I'll give you an example of that in a second. Let me just make one more comment at this stage. This step exposes one of the real strengths in science, and that is the use of multiple working hypotheses. Not just one hypothesis. You don't come up with one possible explanation. You come up with several, if you can, or more. That way you don't inherit a pet hypothesis, which makes it really hard to dump. If you only have one possible explanation for a pattern, you're likely to accept that as your explanation if the prediction holds up, even though you refuted nothing. Even worse, you'll be inclined to do whatever it takes to save your pet hypothesis if it's the only one you can think of. And that means attacking assumptions and blaming them if a prediction fails to hold. Okay, sticking with step 3. We can also see that if prediction A, prediction B, and prediction C are upheld, that's entirely consistent with hypothesis 1. But those aren't predictions that follow from the other two hypotheses, so finding A, B, and C don't disprove the others, so it doesn't really make a heck of a lot of progress here, does it? Nothing's disproven. Progress in science follows from disproving alternatives, and that happens when a prediction is not observed to be true. If hypothesis 2 actually predicted not finding prediction A, then we would have made real progress, right? We would be using what is following the title of Platt's 1964 paper in Science, we would have been using strong inference. We're using strong inference if we can generate a prediction that simultaneously follows necessarily from one hypothesis, but is inconsistent with another hypothesis. So if you find it, you've dumped one. If you don't find it, you've dumped one. You make progress either way. Now, some areas of study are better able to use this potential strength than are other areas. For example, in biochemistry, researchers predicted, that one X-ray diffraction pattern should occur if DNA replicated conservatively, and another pattern should come out if it replicated semi-conservatively. Just looking at the X-ray pattern automatically supported one idea and refuted the other. And that's real progress. Unfortunately, many areas of scientific study, like ecology, don't lend themselves to that kind of strong inference because there may be multiple causes behind a pattern. Oh, I think it's predation. Oh, I think it's competition. Oh, I think it's the weather. And they all play a role, so you can't dump any of them. Okay? Instead, what you do at that point is you rely on information theoretic statistical approaches to weigh the relative contributions of a bunch of things that you can't disprove. Okay? So sometimes you can play the game with strong inference, but often not. So back to our hypothetical example. All right. Remember, we're supposed to generate a series of predictions that absolutely necessarily follow from each hypothesis. So if food resources were depleted by cutting the forest, right, hypothesis 1, and more young starved, then what would you predict? Well, let's think of some things. Well, we'd predict insect captures on sticky boards should be lower in the treated areas, right? There's less food resources. Maybe we predict body mass of fledglings should be lower. The mean body mass of fledglings should be lower in treated areas. If predators invaded the treated areas, then you might predict fewer predator tracks on smoke boards in the treated areas, or higher nest predation rates in the treated areas. If your third idea is true, young birds are more wary in treated forests, then you predict something like, equal nest fledging rates between the two forest types. The same number came out, but the behavior's different, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, the last step. We use statistics again to see which predictions are supported and which are not. It's interesting that we test each of these predictions to see which are likely to be true and which are likely to be false. So this is a place in science where we actually have a form of proof and disproof. We accept or reject that the prediction is upheld. Now, in many areas of science, there are often multiple causes, as I mentioned before, that contribute to the creation of a pattern, and you can't eliminate any of them. And the predictions of all hypotheses are upheld and none are eliminated, and this is where information theoretic tools come into play to help you weigh the relative contribution of each hypothesis in explaining the pattern. Here's our example again. Suppose this is what happens. We reject virtually every prediction we don't find it to be held except for PD there, where there's higher nest predation rates in treated areas. So we look at our hypotheses and go, well, at least H2 is closer than the other two because one of the things came out right. Okay, so it's hard to know exactly what to conclude when you get these kinds of results where your predictions aren't coming out. Maybe there's a hypothesis or an explanation you didn't think of, right? Maybe there's H4, H5, H6. On the other hand, maybe H2 really is true, right? But the prediction that fewer predator tracks should be on smoke boards is not a good prediction because that requires an assumption that smoke boards reflect predator abundance. And maybe that assumption is not true. Maybe smoke boards don't reflect predator abundance because the predators that are effective, most effective, don't even move around on the ground and leave tracks on smoke boards. Maybe they're bird predators or snakes or something. So if that's true, then maybe H2 is still alive. Well, let's look at H1 again. At least that one was dumped cleanly, right? Well, maybe not. Maybe there's an assumption that insect numbers on sticky boards accurately reflect food availability. Maybe that assumption is not a reasonable one. The availability of food for birds may not be measured very well by little sticky boards. They don't capture the things the birds are actually eating, perhaps. So maybe if that assumption isn't a good one, then you wouldn't predict insect captures on sticky boards to be lower in treated areas. Therefore, maybe that wasn't something we predicted. Therefore, maybe we never should have predicted that, and it shouldn't be in the equation there. Furthermore, look at the second one. We expect the mean body mass of fledglings should be lower, but maybe we don't predict that. That assumes the chance of starvation is reflected in mean fledgling mass, and maybe that's not the case. Okay, maybe the weight of the birds when they jump off the nest is identical in the two forest types, but they starve in one forest and not the other. Later, after they're off the nest. See the problem with all of these assumptions is they have to be airtight. You have to generate a prediction that absolutely necessarily follows. And if your logic isn't tight, you're not going to play the game very effectively. And it's very easy to find flaws in people's logic because they make assumptions that probably aren't reasonable assumptions to make, and they generate predictions that probably aren't reasonable predictions to be making. So anyway, this is the way the game's played. It's always best to illustrate concepts, not just with hypothetical examples like the Western tanager, but with real, empirical examples. So let me review the whole process by showing you how three of us use the scientific method to understand why saguaros always seem to grow under palo verde or ironwood trees in the desert. And this is a study we published after conducting the research during spring break as part of my field ecology class back in the 1980s. All right? Basically, we needed to first establish the fact that saguaros do indeed grow more commonly under the canopy of large trees or shrubs. It seemed like that just sort of looking around, but we needed to establish that as a fact. We needed to do step one, convince ourselves there's a non-random pattern. So we generated transects straight through the desert, pack our lunch, and go walking through the desert and record what is available in terms of space for saguaros to be growing in. Is it open space? Is it under the canopy of plant A, plant B, plant C, that kind of thing? And when you do a bunch of these transects and walk miles, you'll find that about 60% of the space out in the desert there is open. It's open space, dirt, and then about 20% is Laria, which is the creosote bush, and then other plant species on down the line, the bigger plants on the right. Okay, if saguaros grow randomly in space then, if they're just out there totally randomly, they should be in the open 60% of the time and under the canopy of some shrub or another about 10% of the time, right? Now, here's what you actually observe, the yellow. Notice they're hardly ever in the open. They're most often under the canopy of some other plant and very often under the larger plants. So we did step one. We observed, measured, and used frequentist statistics to establish there is indeed a non-random pattern of interest. Saguaros grow in the company of palo verde more often than expected due to chance. Now we had the $64,000 question. Why? Now this gets to step two. You just brainstorm possible alternative explanations or hypotheses. So here are some possible ones that we came up with. These bigger plants could be nurse plants, especially palo verde, Circidium, providing the only suitable environment for seed germination. Maybe seeds are everywhere, but the only place to germinate is under under a plant there for some reason. Or maybe they provide shade, which decreases the chance of heat stress and desiccation in summer when they're little baby saguaros. Maybe H3, nurse plants provide cover, which decreases the chance of freezing in winter. It's darn cold in the desert in winter. Oh, I know another one, H4. Nurse plants could provide protection from predation or mechanical damage when they're young. If you don't believe that this sort of thing's possible, just take a look at some of these plants that get munched down by squirrels and rabbits and things. So predation is a problem, especially when they're little. And during a drought year, these things can get hammered. Okay? So the last one, nurse plants could provide refuge from seed predation. Maybe they provide dispersal sites for seeds. This is the only one that involves seeds and the distribution of seeds, so that's what we capitalized on when we were in the desert. We predicted, and this is so cool because it's strong inference. Some of the hypotheses predict one thing, and one hypothesis predicts something, the opposite. The last one predicts seed should occur predominantly under shrubs. It's hypothesizing that there's refuge from seed predation, or it's a seed dispersal site under these bushes, and that's where all the seeds are. You just don't find them out in the open. All the other hypotheses predict that seeds should be everywhere, right? But they just don't do well anywhere except under the nurse tree. Well, what's cool is saguaro seeds are readily identifiable. There's one down in the lower right. They look like little commas. And here's a picture of a bunch that we took with a pin on the lower left, so you can see, you can actually find these things. All you do is take a sample of a little tin can in the soil, a centimeter or two deep, throw it in a bucket of water, the seeds float, you skim the seeds off the surface and start counting. So we have our hypothetical tree here, and where we sampled were 3 different places, midway between the canopy edge and the trunk of the tree, right at the edge, and a meter away from the edge of the tree. And if you look at the data, bingo. Look at this. Seed distribution. There are tons of seeds under the canopy of this vegetation, hardly any on the edge or out in the open. So there's a non-random distribution of seeds. It's consistent with the last hypothesis, inconsistent with all the other hypotheses. We just dumped 4 or 5 hypotheses and we're left with the only possible explanation, which is non-random dispersal of seeds. Well, what's causing that? You know, you can trap animals out there in the desert and put traps in different places and find that little pocket mice and kangaroo rats and ground squirrels tend to operate largely under vegetation. So they'd be eating seeds under there. That wouldn't have led to the pattern that we see. The other possible thing that's going on is seeds become available in the middle of summer. See these seeds, the little black seeds right there on top of a saguaro. And what gets them? Birds. White-winged doves. They just chomp down on these seeds. Then what do? They fly to the open space, sit on the ground? No. They go into trees. And then they poop. And out comes a seed. And it's a perfect place then for germination. And it's the non-random distribution of these seeds because of bird dispersal that you tend to see these patterns. So this, we think, is what's going on. And this is still not the story you're going to read about when you go see the pattern interpreted in parks, because the old nurse tree ideas die hard. Anyway, science is the process we use to gain what we believe is a more complete understanding of this particular pattern in nature, a pattern that's captured human imagination for a long time. If you want to see a little video on this story, you can just click on Exploring with Dick Hutto, and I think it's number 1 or something that has this desert architecture, or I don't remember. I think it's number 1 that talks about this. I want to emphasize the game is simple enough that kids can understand the basic idea. We once worked with 4th, 5th graders, 4th and 5th, at Sussex School in Missoula, where we let them build bird feeders. A bunch of different feeders were then placed outside the classroom window, and the kids immediately noticed some feeders got a lot of use and others didn't. You don't even need statistics to tell that there's a non-random pattern. Statistics are not essential to do good science. Now, the kids made suggestions for why some feeders were used and others weren't. Hey, it could have been the seed type. It could have been feeder type. Johnny's feeder's so cool, and Mary's isn't, or Rebecca's is a cool color, and so-and-so's isn't. Or it could have been the feeder placement. They were unlimited, basically, the number of hypotheses. They were limited only by their imagination. These came out with lots of different ideas. What's really cool is then they tested the ideas by moving the feeders. That simultaneously supported one of the hypotheses and dumped all the others, right? Strong inference. They moved the feeder, and the birds didn't go with that feeder. So it wasn't the color, it wasn't the feeder style, it wasn't the seeds, it was the location that was determining the use. Now, on to what I perceive as problems with the science in practice. I published a paper in Bioscience a couple of years ago about how I believe students and teachers and scientists themselves are distorting this beautiful process. And specifically, I noted there's beauty in the method, but the beauty can become distorted if parts of the process are misrepresented or misplaced or missing altogether. And unfortunately, such distortion seems to be becoming more common. Specifically, students and practicing scientists alike are dwelling excessively on statistical hypothesis testing at the expense of research hypothesis testing. Many are even using the word prediction in association with statistical hypothesis testing where it does not belong. Consequently, these distortions are converting a process designed to help explain natural phenomena through the use of strong inference, as Platt talked about, into a process that's little more than an empty exercise in fact-finding. Why has such a simple process become distorted? A couple of big things. Research and statistical hypotheses are not the same thing. Okay, research hypotheses are explanations for something. Statistical hypotheses are not. Research hypotheses can be considered guesses, but those guesses are still explanations of a pattern. They are not, as frequently taught, guesses about the outcome of an experiment. Another source of confusion involves the use of the word prediction. Predictions are not guesses about which hypothesis is most likely to be the explanation, nor are they guesses about the outcome of an experiment. They're consequences that follow logically and necessarily from a stated research hypothesis. These can be observational, comparative, or experimental in nature. Simply put, if a prediction is not part of an if-then series, then it doesn't belong. So your assignment, now to the real issue. It turns out these misconceptions are not restricted to K-12 teachers and students. They're pervasive at the university and professional levels as well. So what we want to do is have you go to the published literature, find an example from published wildlife biology or biology literature where scientific hypotheses are confused with statistical hypotheses, where predictions might be confused with hypotheses, or where any other part of the process seems to be distorted to you. Just cut and paste, provide an example and a citation of where you got it onto the Moodle assignment module, and that will be our lesson on scientific methodology. Here, just to show you how easy this assignment is, go to your web browser, look at some of your journals, pick any journal you want. Here's a condor, there's a bird journal. Go to the very latest issue in progress. This is right now, 2014. And pick an article that looks interesting to you. Annual migratory patterns of long-billed curlews in the West, American West. Sure, we'll pick that. Then go into the paper. Usually go down to the introduction, and people talk about the framework for their study often at the very end, what their hypotheses might be or their predictions and that kind of thing. So here we see all the way down at the end, because males acquire territories to display to mates and females abandon broods earlier than males, we hypothesized that different breeding roles could affect migration timing, such that males would arrive in the breeding grounds earlier and depart later than females. Well, now that's interesting. We hypothesized that. Is that a hypothesis? Why didn't they just say we expected, based on the different roles that males and females play? It's not a hypothesis. It's not an explanation of anything. And so you see how the words are out there. People use these words, but they're not using them in a way that reflects the scientific method. So see what you can find.